before long, we're going to get to the realization that this idea that it's fair and balanced and reasonable and rational to say I'm for these wars but not those wars is worse than the idea of saying I'm for slavery in some instances and not others. In this country right now, we have a majority that says we never should have gone into Iraq, and a majority that says we never should have gone into Afghanistan. And yet, at the time that we went into both of those wars, we had a majority saying, yes, let's do it. And so all of the political reforms and activism and revolution that we need also depend on the longer-term work of educating and building the understanding so that we can say no to war lies when they happen, when they matter. Because once we get a war started, it doesn't matter if we turn against it. It's very, very hard to end. And arguably, we've been doing a good job for some years now on Iran, where we've been hearing war lies about Iran and not believing them. So there is cause for encouragement, and yet I think we may have a long way to go. And as I looked back at wars that this country started and wars that other countries started for thousands of years, I just couldn't find a war that wasn't based on lies. Lies to get it started, the sinking of the Maine, that there was no evidence Spain did, the invasion of Mexico where we said Mexico invaded us, the sinking of the Lusitania that we knew was full of arms and troops that helped get us into World War I. Every war involves lies to get it started, and often contradictory lies. Lies, not just specific lies, but racism and fear and religious bigotry and things that motivate a certain segment of the population to want to wipe some other people off the face of the earth. And at the same time, lies about how what we're doing is a crusade for democracy and humanitarian effort and so forth. And then lies that we see replace those lies when they fall apart, and lies to keep the wars going along, and the endless lies about how the wars are for the sake of the troops who are fighting in the wars, and the lies about things like a surge that, you know, when our president spoke in the Oval Office a couple of months back about the two big wars we've got right now, he went through all the lies, resuscitated all the lies, starting with the weapons of mass destruction, but then he really focused on the lies about the surge in Iraq. Right? This lie that what you do to fix a war that's hopeless and endless is to escalate it, right? Which you'll recall is what we all voted for the Democrats for in 2006, was to escalate the war in Iraq, right? And they did it for us, and then they lied about it for us, and now it's being used to justify the escalations in Afghanistan. And so I go at some length in the book into these myths about surges doing any good in a war. And I think that at some point before long, we're going to get to the realization that this idea that it's fair and balanced and reasonable and rational to say I'm for these wars but not those wars is worse than the idea of saying I'm for slavery in some instances and not others, or I'm for torture in some cases and not others. And I realize that one is coming back in our culture, but that used to be an example of something you wouldn't say, that I'm for some types of torture. I think war is the worst offense there is, and yet it's one that we tolerate more than others. You know, when I looked back through all of these war lies before, during, and after wars, what you see people talking about in public and in private is very different. And for that reason, I think WikiLeaks is very, very helpful to us. Yeah. Because, you know, it's supposed to sort of just tell us that some treasonous Australian doesn't call his girlfriends back after he has sex with them in Sweden. And you know, the whole story is about the operation itself. And yet, we have seen official cables that present strong evidence that we have a ground war in Pakistan that they've been lying to us about. We have bombing wars in Pakistan and Yemen that those governments are joining with our government to lie to the world about. We have coups in Honduras that we're supporting and lying about. We have the embassy in Norway doing nothing but sell Lockheed Martin to Norway. The bulk of our diplomats around the world taking direction from the CIA and the Pentagon and serving as assistant weapons salesmen and women. The extensive efforts that our government is going to pressure Spain and Italy and Germany and England not to investigate or prosecute our war crimes and our torture. The previous incident of an oil well blowout by BP that was quite similar to the one that we thought was a first in the Gulf of Mexico that our government knew about. I mean, it's just endless revelations of our tax dollars paying for diplomats. And we still like to talk about diplomacy as an alternative to militarism. And yet we see the diplomats serving as servants of the Pentagon and taking direction from the CIA, taking criminal direction from the CIA to spy on other nations' UN representatives and so forth. It's just beyond anything that we've seen in recent years in terms of shining a light into what our government is up to. And we're supposed to not appreciate that. We're supposed to be angry that our government that someone has let us know anything that our government was about. And so in the book, I look at what people talk about in private, including how we've got to get some Americans killed to really lock us into this war, and how they talk in public, including we've got to continue this war for the sake of the troops who are in it. And there are very different claims. But most of the real reasons for the wars are not secrets. They're just not endlessly repeated. And they show up on page 15 once, and that's that. And the wars are promoted as profitable. That's just not the headline and the television news. The wars are motivated by desires for resources and markets and profits and bases and stationings of weapons and so forth. And it's not kept very secret. But then they're also about domination and avoiding humiliation and controlling any potential rivals and enforcing our credibility as the strong man in the world. And much of the basis for wars seems to be irrational. You know, these people have meetings where they've decided to escalate a war, and they're trying to figure out why, for their own sake. You know, then they have to figure out why to tell us. It's complete madness, and that's what we're seeing right now with Afghanistan. They know it's hopeless. We see in a WikiLeaks cable the president of the European Union telling our country, this is pointless, this is hopeless, we're in it out of deference to the United States. Which, I'm sorry, that's not deference to the United States, the majority of whose sovereign citizens are against the thing. It's deference to Barack Obama. So I looked at a lot of wars, and I didn't go through in the book and chronicle war by war because it would get endless and repetitive and very long. So I took themes. So there are chapters like wars are not fought against evil, wars are not launched in defense, wars are not waged out of generosity, wars are not unavoidable, and so forth. The themes that are used to sell us these wars and to keep them going and to keep the machinery in place. And I draw examples from lots of wars. And, you know, I think it may not be needed to be said in this room, but in most rooms where I've spoken, it's been very difficult in an hour to convince people that some ancient wars were not glorious. And yet, I think it's significant that if you go back 70 years to find a war to justify the current war machine, you have to take into consideration the fact that that was a very different world. And now, the United States dominates the entire globe We've sliced it up into Northern Command and Southern Command and Central Command and outer space and cyberspace. And were a single other nation to attempt anything of the sort, even if they called it defense, we would have all-out global war and destruction. And so to argue that we need the war machine because some war 3/4 of a century ago was justifiable is madness. When we can't survive this economically, we can't survive it politically, we can't survive it environmentally, we can't survive the blowback, we can't survive the nuclear proliferation, there is no way we can survive the current course we're on. So this is not even about making the world a better, more civilized place that's outgrown killing. This is about surviving now. So I want to just read a brief section out of the book and to give you a flavor of it, and then say a couple words about what we can be doing, and then open this up for questions. And this is a brief section called, "If You're Not for War, You're for Tyrants, Slavery, and Nazism." The United States was born out of a war against the figure of King George, whose crimes are listed in the Declaration of Independence. George Washington was correspondingly glorified. King George of England and his government were guilty of crimes alleged, but other colonies gained their rights and independence without a war. As with all wars, no matter how old and glorious, the American Revolution was driven by lies. The story of the Boston Massacre, for example, was distorted beyond recognition, including in an engraving by Paul Revere that depicted the British as butchers. Benjamin Franklin produced a fake issue of the Boston Independent in which the British boasted of scalp hunting. Thomas Paine and other pamphleteers sold the colonists on war, but not without misdirection and false promises. Howard Zinn describes what happened. Quote, "Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from favorites of the British Empire. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new privileged leadership." End quote. As Zinn notes, prior to the revolution, there had been 18 uprisings against colonial governments, 6 black rebellions, and 40 riots, and the political elites saw a possibility for redirecting anger toward England. Still, the poor who would not profit from the war or reap its political rewards had to be compelled by force to fight in it. Many, including slaves promised greater liberty by the British, deserted or switched sides. Punishment for infractions in the Continental Army was 100 lashes. When George Washington, the richest man in America, was unable to convince Congress to raise the legal limit to 500 lashes, he considered using hard labor as a punishment instead, but dropped that idea because the hard labor would have been indistinguishable from regular service in the Continental Army. Soldiers also deserted because they needed food, clothing, shelter, medicine, and money. They signed up for pay, were not paid, and endangered their families' well-being by remaining in the Army unpaid. About 2/3 of them were ambivalent to or against the cause for which they were fighting and suffering. Popular rebellions like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts would follow the revolutionary victory. The American revolutionaries were also able to open up the West to expansion and wars against the Native Americans, something the British had been forbidding. The American Revolution, the very act of birth and liberation for the United States, was also a war of expansion and conquest. King George, according to the Declaration of Independence, had, quote, endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, end quote. Of course, those were people fighting in defense of their lands and lives. Victory at Yorktown was bad news for their future as England signed their lands over to the new nation. Another sacred war in U.S. history, the Civil War, was fought, so many believe, in order to put an end to the evil of slavery. In reality, that goal was a belated excuse for a war already well underway, much like spreading democracy to Iraq became a belated justification for a war begun in 2003, overwhelmingly in the name of eliminating fictional weaponry. In fact, the mission of ending slavery was required to justify a war that had become too horrifying to be justified solely by the empty political goal of union. Patriotism had not yet been puffed up into quite the enormity it is today. Casualties were mounting sharply: 25,000 at Shiloh, 20,000 at Bull Run, 24,000 in a day at Antietam. A week after Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves only where Lincoln could not free the slaves, except by winning the war. His orders freed slaves only in southern states that had seceded, not in border states that remained in the Union. Yale historian Harry Stout explains why Lincoln took this step. Quote, "By Lincoln's calculation, the killing must continue on ever grander scales, but for that to succeed, the people must be persuaded to shed blood without reservation. This, in turn, required a moral certitude that the killing was just. Only emancipation, Lincoln's last card, would provide such certitude. The proclamation," end quote. "The proclamation also worked against Britain's entering the war on the side of the South. We can't know for certain what would have happened to the colonies without the Revolution, or to slavery without the Civil War. But we know that much of the rest of the hemisphere ended colonial rule and slavery without wars. Had Congress found the decency to end slavery through legislation, perhaps the nation would have ended it without division. Had the American South been permitted to secede in peace, and the fugitive slave law been easily repealed by the North, it seems unlikely slavery would have lasted much longer." The most sacred and unquestionable war in U.S. history, however, is World War II. I save a full discussion of this war for Chapter 4, but note here only that in the minds of many Americans today, World War II was justified because of the degree of evilness of Adolf Hitler, and that evilness is to be found above all in the Holocaust. But you won't find any recruitment posters of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you to save the Jews." When a resolution was introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1934 expressing surprise and pain at Germany's actions and asking that Germany restore rights to Jews, the State Department caused it to be buried in committee. By 1937, Poland had developed a plan to send Jews to Madagascar, and the Dominican Republic had a plan to accept them as well. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain came up with a plan to send Germany's Jews to Tanganyika in East Africa. Representatives of the United States, Britain, and South American nations met at Lake Geneva in July 1938, and all agreed that none of them would accept Jews. On November 15, 1938, reporters asked President Franklin Roosevelt what could be done. He replied that he would refuse to consider allowing more immigrants than the standard quota system allowed. Bills were introduced in Congress to allow 20,000 Jews under the age of 14 to enter the United States. Senator Robert Wagner, Democrat of New York, said, quote, "Thousands of American families have already expressed their willingness to take refugee children into their homes," end quote. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt set aside her anti-Semitism to support the legislation, but her husband successfully blocked it for years. In July 1940, Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, intended to send all Jews to Madagascar, which now belonged to Germany, France having been occupied. The ships would need to wait only until the British, which now meant Winston Churchill, ended their blockade. That day never came. On November 25, 1940, the French ambassador asked the U.S. Secretary of State to consider accepting German Jewish refugees then in France. On December 21st, the Secretary of State declined. By July 1941, the Nazis had determined that a final solution for the Jews would consist of genocide rather than expulsion. In 1942, with the assistance of the Census Bureau, the United States locked up 110,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese in various internment camps, primarily on the West Coast, where they were identified by numbers rather than names. This action taken by President Roosevelt was supported 2 years later by the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1943, off-duty white U.S. troops attacked Latinos and African Americans in Los Angeles' Zoot Suit riots, stripping and beating them in the streets in a manner that would have made Hitler proud. The Los Angeles City Council, in a remarkable effort to blame the victims, responded by banning the style of clothing worn by Mexican immigrants called the Zoot Suit. When U.S. troops were crammed onto the Queen Mary in 1945, headed for the European War, blacks were kept apart from whites and stowed in the depths of the ship near the engine room, as far as possible from fresh air, and in the same location in which blacks had been brought to America from Africa centuries before. African American soldiers who survived World War II could not legally return home to many parts of the United States if they had married white women overseas. White soldiers who had married Asians were up against the same anti-miscegenation laws in 15 states. It is simply preposterous to suggest that the United States fought World War II against racial injustice or to save the Jews. What we are told wars are for is extremely different from what they are really for. So, a couple of words about what we can be doing. I think that one thing we should be focused on at the moment is that for the first time in many, many years, the elite, powerful people in Washington across the political spectrum are talking about cutting a big chunk out of the military budget. I don't think, right-wing groups are pushing this to Congress. The Cat Food Commission, as some of us call it, the Deficit Commission, is proposing it. The progressive members, such as they are proposing it. I don't think it has a snowball's chance without massive popular demand, but I'm encouraged by the fact that coalitions are being formed around the country on this agenda of moving the money from where none of us want it to where we need it. And environmental groups and groups that work on housing and every other issue, any issue there is, they all want money. Where the peace movement works on the issue where we want to get rid of the money. It makes a very good partnership, and cities are passing resolutions saying to Congress, stop spending the money there, we want it there. You can go to a website I have called Defund War, not defend, but defundwar.org, and find links to groups around the country that are working on this. I'm 1,000% for running primary challengers against our president. I'd like to see 18 of them out there right now. But I think if we leave all power in the hands of a president and just try to get a different person in there, we're done for. I would love to see new political parties and big third-party political parties, and I support them entirely. But unless we fix the system we've got, a third party will have to be nearly as corrupt as one of the other two to make it. And if we get the reforms we need, then we'll be able to run third, fourth, fifth party candidates and even candidates that don't bow down before any party but answer to their constituents. And so I think what we're missing most is the communications and activist organizing institutions that don't put themselves beneath any party, but operate outside the parties. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C., with a lot of people who do sort of liberal activism and online organizing and work for Democrats' campaigns, and they had conference sessions with headlines with topics like things like why the Democrats are sucking so much. And everybody in that room spoke in the first person, we the Democrats, right? If you had a conference, and the Koch brothers have these, if you had a conference of the right-wingers, of the funders of the corporate front groups, of the Chamber of Commerce, of Fox News, of the Tea Party, they don't talk about we the Republicans. They talk about how they can make everybody worse, the Republicans and the Democrats alike. They work from the outside and they pressure and they put up candidates that may lose because they support their agenda, even if they're crazy. And we don't have that yet on the left. So we have wonderful groups. We have the groups sponsoring this event. We have peace groups like Code Pink. We have the Veterans for Peace, and all of us that were there chaining 135 people to the White House fence a couple of days ago against these wars. But we don't have big investment. We don't have the money. We don't have the labor movement. The labor movement doesn't even have the labor movement anymore. And so one growing organization that I encourage you to check out as an alternative to the Tea Party is called the Job Party. And you can go to jobparty.org or .us and find that. The reason that the war on terrorism or the war on terror or the war on the terror is such a brilliant propaganda move is that unlike the communist threat, it can never be proven to have gone away. Right? The communist threat could end. The terrorist threat, with terrorism defined as resistance to what we're doing, is permanently there, and you can never prove that some little handful of mastermind evil terrorists doesn't exist. It can't be done. It's like proving there's no God. And so it's the most brilliant propaganda coup we've seen, and it.
Julian Assange is being called a terrorist.
Right. We are calling people terrorists and enemy combatants and punishing them without a charge or a conviction. Bradley Manning is in isolation these past 7 months without being charged with a crime, while Bush and Cheney run around free bragging about their crimes because we've decided that we're not going to have the rule of law on either end of the spectrum. We're going to punish people without the law, and we're going to let people go free despite the law if they are in power. What we're going to have is protection of those who are on the side of the Pentagon and punishment of those who are not. And it's a very, very dangerous thing, and I think that you're right that one of the many things we have to do is be careful about how we're describing it and how we talk about it. So I agree with you.
Hi, I'm Ann with the San Jose Peace and Justice Center, and we're here with David Swanson today, who's doing a book tour for his new book called War is a Lie. Could you tell us a little bit about your book tour?
Well, this is my second book, and on my first book, which was called Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union, I did about 60 cities, and it was too much. I mean, it was fun, and I actually learned a great deal about parts of the country that I otherwise haven't been to, and what people were doing there, activist groups, because I was doing peace and justice group events, but it was too much, and I have to be home, and I have to do work at home, and so I'm doing 5 cities.